No one on Draxer, and 9 remembered when the old orc widow had stopped being a person. Now, she was only a rumor. Every morning, before the mining sirens echoed across the iron canyons, the people of Blackstone Colony watched her appear from the desert road like a ghost from another age. She walked slowly through the market beneath the smoke of refinery towers, carrying the same faded cloth bag and wearing the same heavy iron veil chained around the lower half of her face. The market always changed when she arrived. Conversations became quieter. Children moved behind their parents. Even the loud, drunken miners lowered their eyes as she passed. Nobody insulted her anymore. Fear had grown older than cruelty. The humans of Draxer 9 called her many things. The Ash Widow, the Iron Monster, but the name that survived the longest was simple. The Broken Orc. Nobody used her real name now. Not after the border wars. Not after the fire. And certainly not after what happened to her husband. The colony's younger generation only knew fragments of the story whispered in dark corners of bars and cargo stations. They said her husband died screaming during the last siege against the Outer Raiders. They said she went mad after his death. Some claimed she killed men with her bare hands during the war. Others swore she survived a plasma explosion that melted steel walls around her body. But no story explained why she hid her face, and nobody was brave enough to ask. The widow herself never spoke about the past. She lived alone beyond the city shield perimeter where the wasteland began, in a rusted home buried beneath red sand and broken machinery. No family visited her. No friends came searching. Only silence kept her company. Yet every morning, she still came to the market. Not because she enjoyed it, because loneliness became easier when surrounded by strangers. That morning felt different. The air carried static. The twin moons above Draxa 9 glowed pale red behind gathering clouds of magnetic dust. Old miners muttered nervously while securing cargo nets outside their shops. A storm was coming. A bad one. By sunset, warning sirens screamed across the colony. Emergency shield protocols activated. People rushed indoors as giant defense barriers rose around Blackstone Colony. Steel gates slammed shut. Supply drones disappeared from the sky. Then the storm arrived. The desert exploded. Wind strong enough to tear metal apart crashed against the city's shields. Red sand swallowed the streets. Electricity flickered violently through the colony grid before everything suddenly went black. The shields failed. Panic spread instantly. Without shield protection, the magnetic storm could fry ships, engines, even life support systems. Then came the impact. A massive explosion thundered beyond the outer wall. For one terrible second, the entire colony shook. People froze. Some climbed rooftops to look beyond the storm. Far in the wasteland, flames rose into the darkness. A ship had crashed, but nobody moved. Not the guards, not the rescue crews, not even the soldiers. The storm outside was suicide. Whoever was out, there is already dead, someone whispered. Inside the darkness of her small desert home, the old orc widow sat silently beside a dim lantern. The storm rattled her walls like claws scraping against a coffin. Then she heard it. A voice, faint, distant, screaming for help through the wind. Her hands tightened instantly. For a long moment, she remained perfectly still. The colony had abandoned people before. She knew that better than anyone. Slowly, she stood. Outside, the storm screamed like a living creature. Sand lashed against her iron veil as she wrapped herself in heavy survival cloth and stepped into the darkness alone. No one saw her leave. The wasteland tried to kill her with every step. Burning debris fell from the sky. Broken metal from the crashed ship littered the dunes. The air smelled of smoke, fuel, and scorched wires. Then she found the wreckage. Half the transport ship had buried itself deep inside the sand. Fire crawled along shattered engines while emergency alarms echoed weakly through the storm. Inside the broken cockpit, a human man lay trapped beneath collapsed steel beams. Young, maybe 30, blood covered one side of his face. He was barely conscious. The widow forced the metal upward with a painful roar, ignoring the burning heat slicing into her hands. The human cried out as she dragged him free from the wreckage. Then her damaged iron veil snapped loose. For the first time in years, another person saw her face. The scars stretched across her skin like melted stone. One, I carried the marks of old plasma burns. The left side of her jaw was twisted from injuries no surgeon could fully repair. Most people reacted the same way. Shock, fear, disgust. But this human only stared at her weakly through half-open eyes. And smiled. Yuri whispered painfully. The widow prepared herself for the usual horror in his voice. Instead, the stranger quietly said, "You're beautiful." The storm seemed to vanish. The widow froze completely, because nobody had said those words to her in over 20 years. Then the human lost consciousness and collapsed into her arms as flames rose behind them in the endless desert night. The old orc widow carried the unconscious human through the storm for nearly 2 hours. By the time she reached her home beyond the colony walls, the winds had calmed, but the desert still howled like a wounded beast. Red dust covered her cloak. Blood dripped from her burned hands where the ship's metal had torn into her skin. Yet she barely noticed the pain. Her thoughts remained trapped on the stranger's final words. "You're beautiful." The sentence echoed inside her mind like something forbidden, like a memory she was never supposed to touch again. Her home stood alone among rusted machine graveyards and broken mining towers swallowed by sand. Most people believed the wasteland beyond Blackstone Colony was empty, but the widow had built a life there from forgotten things. Old engine parts became walls. Broken ship glass became windows. Dead metal became shelter. Inside, the house felt strangely warm compared to the coldness of the colony. Small glowing lamps hung from chains. Strange purple flowers grew in cracked containers near the windows, carefully protected from the harsh desert air. The widow laid the human on an old medical table once used during the war. He was in terrible condition. A steel fragment had pierced his shoulder. Several ribs were cracked. One side of his body carried electrical burns from the crash. His pulse weakened by the minute. The widow worked silently. She cleaned wounds with bitter medicinal oils, wrapped bandages around torn flesh, used ancient battlefield tools modern doctors no longer bothered learning. Outside, emergency broadcasts echoed faintly from the distant colony speakers. Governor Varkes has declared temporary security lockdown. Unidentified ships may have entered the sector. Citizens are warned not to assist outsiders. The widow ignored every word. For 3 days, the human drifted between life and death. Sometimes he muttered in his sleep. Sometimes he called for people she did not know. Once, during the darkest part of the night, he grabbed her wrist weakly and whispered, "Don't leave me alone." The words struck harder than they should have, because loneliness understood loneliness. On the 4th morning, she woke to the sound of movement. The human was finally awake. He sat up slowly, breathing hard while staring around the small home in confusion. His eyes stopped on the widow, standing near the doorway. Most people reacted instantly when they saw her. Fear first, question second. But this man only looked tired. "You saved me," he said quietly. His voice was rough from dehydration. The widow gave a short nod. "That ship should have killed you." "Yeah," he answered weakly. "It almost did." There was an awkward silence. Then he smiled slightly. "I admit yes." Nobody introduced themselves to her anymore. Not for years. The widow hesitated before answering. Ture. The name sounded unfamiliar, even to her own ears. Elias Vane recovered slowly over the following days. He learned she lived completely alone beyond the colony perimeter. No visitors, no family, no protection except old weapons hidden beneath floor panels. Yet the longer he stayed, the more confused he became. This was not the home of a monster. It was the home of someone abandoned. He noticed the details others ignored. The flowers outside were carefully watered every morning despite the desert droughts. The walls carried beautiful hand-carved symbols from ancient orc traditions. Tiny metal animals sat on shelves beside old books, and hidden inside a dusty drawer beneath the table, he found war medals, dozens of them, silver stars, military honors, even the crest of Draxier itself, the highest bravery award the colony could give. Elias stared at them in disbelief. People did not give medals to monsters. That night, while storm clouds rolled silently across the distant wasteland, Elias finally asked the question nobody else dared ask. "Why do you hide your face?" The room became very still. Ture stood beside the window for a long time without speaking. Then, slowly, she removed the iron veil. The scars underneath looked even worse in the pale lantern light. Burned flesh twisted across her jaw and neck like melted stone. But Elias did not look away. Not once. Thure's voice remained calm, though something painful moved beneath it. During the border wars, plasma bombers attacked Blackstone Colony. Her eyes lowered slightly. The city's shields failed. Elias listened quietly. There were thousands trapped inside the lower districts. Fires everywhere. Buildings collapsing. She swallowed hard. The governor ordered evacuation of the upper sectors only, meaning the poor were abandoned. Ture continued, "I stay behind." For 16 hours, she carried civilians through burning streets while plasma storms destroyed entire blocks around her. Children, elderly miners, families trapped beneath debris. Then the final explosion hit. She survived, barely. But after the war ended, she whispered, people stopped seeing the hero. Her fingers tightened against the veil. They only saw this. Silence filled the room. Elias felt anger rising inside him like fire. Not toward her, toward the colony, toward every person who allowed someone like Ture to disappear into loneliness after saving their lives. "They failed you," he said quietly. Ture looked stunned by the words, because nobody had ever said that before. Suddenly, a loud mechanical sound thundered outside. Thure's expression changed instantly. She moved toward the window. Red lights appeared across the desert. Hovering drones. Armed military drones. At least 20 of them surrounded the house silently in the darkness. Then the colony loudspeaker crackled alive. "By order of Governor Varkes," a cold voice announced, "the human survivor and the orc known as Ture are to surrender immediately." Elias stared toward the machines surrounding the home. The governor had found them. And outside in the darkness, the drones began powering up their weapons. The first missile hit the widow's house before dawn. The explosion shattered the front wall in a storm of fire and metal. Elias was thrown across the floor while dust and sparks filled the room. Outside, military drones hovered above the desert like red-eyed vultures, their engines growling through the darkness. "Move!" Ture shouted. For the first time since Elias met her, her voice sounded like a soldier's. Not broken. Dangerous. A second blast tore through the roof. Burning debris crashed around them as armored troops surrounded the house from every direction. Governor Varkes had not come to arrest them. He had come to erase them. Outside the drones, giant hologram screens lit up across Blackstone Colony. The governor's face appeared above the streets while frightened citizens gathered beneath the emergency alarms. "The outsider known as Elias Vane," Varkes announced coldly, "is an Earth spy sent to destabilize our colony." His expression darkened, and the orc widow has aided him. The crowd erupted instantly. Fear spread faster than truth ever could. "She betrayed us. Exile her. She always was dangerous." The widow listened silently as the voices echoed from distant city speakers carried by the desert wind. Not one person defended her. Not one. Elias looked at her, waiting for anger. But Ture only lowered her eyes, as if betrayal no longer surprised her. A plasma round blasted through the doorway. "This way," she barked. Ture pulled open a hidden steel hatch beneath the floorboards. Elias followed her underground just seconds before drones unleashed gunfire into the collapsing house above. The tunnel beneath the desert was ancient, older than the colony itself. Rusted pipes lined the walls. Emergency lights flickered weakly overhead while distant explosions shook dust from the ceiling. "You built this?" Elias asked while running beside her. "No," Ture answered. "The resistance did." He stopped. Resistance. Ture hesitated for a moment. Then she led him deeper underground into a hidden chamber buried beneath layers of stone and forgotten machinery. The room looked frozen in time. Old war maps covered the walls. Broken communication equipment sat beneath thick dust. And stacked carefully inside metal containers were dozens of encrypted military data drives. Elias stared in confusion. What is all this? Thuraw's face hardened. The truth. Outside, the governor's voice still echoed faintly through the colony broadcast system. Citizens are ordered to report any information regarding the fugitives. Thuraw ignored it. With shaking hands, she activated one of the ancient data terminals. Static filled the screen before old military footage suddenly appeared. What Elias saw made his blood run cold. 20 years earlier, during the border wars, Blackstone Colony's lower districts had not been destroyed accidentally. Governor Varkes had ordered the shield systems shut down intentionally. Entire neighborhoods had been sacrificed, thousands abandoned, not to save the colony, but to protect wealthy corporate officials hiding in the upper sectors. Elias watched the recordings in horror. Families screaming in burning streets. Emergency calls ignored. Evacuation routes sealed. And in the middle of it all, a younger Thuraw carrying injured civilians through plasma fire while soldiers retreated around her. She found the records after the war, an old resistance message explained through static audio. Governor Varkes ordered her silence immediately. Another file appeared. Medical reports. Psychological evaluations, propaganda campaigns. The governor had turned the colony against her slowly over the years. Rumors, fear, isolation, not because of her scars, because she knew the truth. Elias looked toward Thuraw in disbelief. They destroyed your life. Thuraw remained silent. For a moment, the only sound came from distant explosions above them. Then Elias understood something even worse. You could have exposed him years ago. Yes, but you didn't. Thuraw finally looked at him. Pain filled her eyes, but something stronger existed beneath it. If the truth came out after the war, she said quietly, the colony would have torn itself apart. Civil war, revenge, mass executions. She had seen enough death already. So instead, she chose silence and allowed herself to become the villain people needed. Elias felt something break inside him. This woman had sacrificed everything twice. First her body, then her entire life. And the people she protected hated her for it. Suddenly the tunnel shook violently. Warning alarms flashed red across the old bunker. Thuraw's expression changed instantly. They found us. Outside, heavy assault drones descended into the wasteland, scanning the desert with searchlights bright enough to cut through the storm darkness. Governor Varkes had stopped pretending. Now he wanted them dead. The underground chamber exploded inward as plasma fire ripped through the walls. Soldiers stormed inside. Chaos erupted instantly. Thuraw fought like something reborn from war itself. She moved through smoke and sparks with terrifying precision, disarming soldiers and dragging Elias toward the escape tunnel. But there were too many. An electric shock round slammed into Elias's chest. Pain exploded through his body. He collapsed instantly. Elias, Thuraw roared. Soldiers grabbed him before she could reach him. Energy restraints locked around his wrists while drones aimed directly at her head. Governor Varkes himself appeared on a holographic projector near the tunnel entrance. His cold smile widened. "Look at them," he said mockingly, still protecting the monster. Elias struggled violently against the soldiers holding him. Then he looked directly at Thuraw, at the woman who spent 20 years hiding her face while cowards hid their crimes behind hers. And he shouted with everything left in him, "You spent your whole life hiding from monsters without realizing they were the ones hiding from you." The words echoed through the burning chamber. The soldiers dragged Elias away. Silence followed. Slowly, for the first time in years, Thuraw reached for her iron veil. Then she removed it completely. Not with shame, not with fear, but with the calm expression of someone who had finally stopped hiding from the world. And deep within the burning ruins beneath Draxine, the old warrior prepared for war once again. The woman the galaxy forgot. By sunrise, the entire colony knew the old orc widow was alive. And for the first time in 20 years, she was no longer hiding. The great iron gates of Blackstone Colony opened slowly as red dust rolled through the streets like smoke from an ancient battlefield. Workers paused beside refinery towers. Market vendors lowered their voices. Even security patrols stopped moving when they saw her walking toward the city center. No val, no mask, no chains hiding her scars. Only Ture, the woman they had feared for half their lives. Whispers spread instantly through the crowd. That's her, the broken orc. She looks worse than the stories. But something felt different now. People had spent years imagining a monster. Instead, they saw an exhausted woman carrying decades of pain in her eyes. The scars on her face no longer looked terrifying. They looked tragic. Ture walked through the colony slowly while thousands watched in silence. Massive hologram screens above the streets still displayed Governor Varkey's emergency warnings beside Elias's prison image. Traitors to the colony. Dangerous extremists. But the words suddenly felt weaker, because people were finally seeing the truth standing in front of them. An old miner stepped out from the crowd first. His mechanical arm trembled as he stared at her face. Then his eyes widened with recognition. "No," he whispered. "I know you." The crowd turned toward him. The old man pointed shakily at Ture. "She carried my daughter out of the fire during the siege." Silence spread instantly. Another voice rose from deeper in the crowd. "She saved the southern defense line alone." A former soldier pushed forward through the people, staring at her like someone seeing a ghost from his past. "I fought beside her," he said quietly. When the shields collapsed, everyone ran. His voice cracked slightly. "Except her." One by one, forgotten memories returned. Veterans who once stayed silent finally spoke. They remembered Ture dragging wounded civilians through collapsing streets while plasma bombs fell from the sky. They remembered her holding defense barricades alone long enough for evacuation ships to escape. And worst of all, they remembered that Governor Varkey himself would have died during the war if Ture had not carried him from a burning command bunker. The crowd slowly changed. Fear turned into confusion. Confusion became guilt. High above the city in his fortified tower, Governor Varkey watched the growing unrest with rising panic. "This is impossible," he hissed. For 20 years, fear had controlled the colony. Now the fear was breaking, and the truth was spreading faster than he could contain it. Suddenly, emergency sirens exploded across the tower. An officer rushed toward him. "Governor, we have another problem." The hologram shifted instantly. Elias Vane appeared restrained inside an orbital execution chamber aboard Varkey's military station above Draxonine. Execution countdown, 2 hours. Varkey smiled coldly. "If the colony needs a monster," he muttered, "I'll give them one." The public execution broadcast activated across the planet. People watched in horror as Elias was dragged toward the station's central platform. But far beyond the city walls, buried beneath layers of sand and forgotten steel, something ancient awakened. Deep inside a hidden underground hangar, floodlights flickered across a massive warship covered in dust. The Varkalon, a war cruiser from the Border Wars. Ture stood before it silently. She had hidden the ship after the war ended, swearing never to use it again, because every weapon she touched brought death. But Elias was up there, and for the first time in decades, someone had looked at her scars without fear. That mattered more than she wanted to admit. The giant engines roared to life. Across the colony, people looked toward the desert as fire exploded upward into the sky. The forgotten warship rose from beneath the sands like a beast returning from extinction. Governor Varkey's face drained of color. "No." The Varkalon blasted through the atmosphere, tearing through clouds while military fighters launched desperately to intercept it. Space erupted into chaos. Laser fire lit the darkness above Draconine. Explosions ripped across orbit as Ture piloted the ancient cruiser directly toward the governor's station. Despite its age, the warship fought like a predator, because Ture once commanded it. Defense cannons destroyed enemy fighters one after another, while warning alarms screamed throughout the orbital station. Inside his prison restraints, Elias looked upward in disbelief as the station trembled violently. Then he heard the soldiers shouting, "The widow is here." A small smile appeared on Elias's face. Of course she came. The station battle became a nightmare of fire and collapsing metal. Ture forced the cruiser directly into the docking bay, crashing through security barriers before storming inside, armed with old plasma rifles from the war. Not as a monster, as a soldier. The final confrontation happened inside the governor's command chamber while the station burned around them. Varkey stood surrounded by armed guards, but fear had already consumed him. "You should have stayed buried," he spat at her. "Look at yourself. You're hideous." The words echoed through the chamber. For years, those insults would have wounded her. Not anymore. Ture stepped forward slowly, her scarred face illuminated by flames from the collapsing station. Then she spoke with terrifying calm. "These scars are proof that I survived what cowards could not." The room fell silent. Even the guards hesitated, because deep down, they knew she was right. Suddenly, explosions rocked the station harder than before. Warning sirens turned frantic. Core failure detected. Station collapse imminent. The battle outside had damaged the reactor. The orbital station was dying. Metal walls split apart as fire burst through the corridors. Gravity flickered violently while soldiers ran in panic. Ture freed Elias from the restraints just as the station began falling out of orbit. They raced toward the escape bay together while debris crashed around them. But when they finally reached the final launch chamber, both stopped cold. Only one escape pod remained operational. And behind them, the station began to break apart. The station was dying around them. Metal screamed as the massive orbital structure tore itself apart above Drac 9. Fires burst through collapsing corridors while warning sirens echoed like funeral bells through the smoke-filled chamber. And in the center of the chaos, only one escape pod remained. Ture saw it instantly. So did Elias. The small pod barely had enough fuel for a single passenger descent through the atmosphere. Sparks rained from the ceiling as another explosion shook the station violently. "Go," Ture ordered. Elias stared at her like she had lost her mind. "The station's collapsing. That's why you need to leave now." Ture grabbed his arm and shoved him toward the pod controls. Her scarred face remained calm, but her eyes carried something heavy beneath them. Acceptance. She had accepted death a long time ago. Back during the war. Back when the colony decided monsters were easier to blame than cowards. "This ends with me," she said quietly. Another explosion ripped through the chamber. The floor tilted violently as pieces of the station broke away into space. But Elias didn't move. Instead, he stepped away from the pod. Ture froze. "What are you doing?" "I'm not leaving you." For a second, she genuinely looked confused, as if the words made no sense. People abandoned her. People feared her. People survived by leaving her behind. That was how the galaxy worked. "You don't understand," she said harshly. "I'm not worth dying for." Elias looked directly into her damaged eyes. "Yes," he answered. "You are." The words hit harder than any weapon ever could. For the first time in decades, someone chose her over their own safety. Not because they owed her, not because they feared her, but because they cared whether she lived or died. Ture felt something crack deep inside her chest, something colder and older than pain. Loneliness. Suddenly, the chamber alarms changed tone. Reactor meltdown in T-minus 90 seconds. Elias moved fast. He slammed emergency override controls open and began rewiring the damaged escape pod systems manually. "What are you doing?" Ture asked. "Making room for two. That pod can't survive with extra weight. It can if the stabilizers reroute through auxiliary thrust." "You're guessing." Elias smirked weakly while sparks exploded beside him. "I'm a mechanic. Guessing is part of the job." Another violent shockwave tore through the station. Large cracks spread across the walls, revealing burning light from the planet below. The station was falling apart. Fast. Together, they forced the damaged pod systems online just seconds before the launch bay collapsed behind them. The pod blasted free from the station. And moments later, the orbital command station exploded above Draxer, 9 like a second sun. A massive wave of fire spread across the night sky, while burning debris rained through the atmosphere. Across the colony, millions watched the explosion in silence. At the exact same moment, Governor Varkey's hidden military records spread automatically through every public network on the planet. Every lie, every cover-up, every sacrificed civilian. The truth flooded the colony faster than anyone could stop it. And with the destruction of the station, Governor Varkey's disappeared forever inside the fire he created. Weeks passed. For the first time in years, Blackstone Colony felt different. Quieter, not from fear, from reflection. Workers removed the giant propaganda screens from the city towers. The governor's statues were torn down. Former soldiers publicly confessed what happened during the border wars. And slowly, people began speaking Thura's name with respect instead of fear. The rebuilding of Drax and 9 became more than repairing damaged streets and stations. It became about repairing memory. At the center of the Colony Plaza, construction crews raised a massive memorial dedicated to the forgotten heroes of the war. Not politicians, not governors, the people who actually bled for the colony. And standing at the center of the memorial was Thura, not hidden behind an iron veil, not twisted into a monster, but standing tall in bronze and steel with her scars fully visible for the entire colony to see. Children visited the memorial every morning. Veterans left old medals beneath it. Some people cried quietly when they looked at the statue, because guilt can survive longer than lies. One evening, as twin moons glowed softly above the rebuilt city, Elias found Thura standing alone beside the memorial. The plaza lights reflected across her scarred face, while desert wind moved gently through her gray hair. She no longer wore the veil, but sometimes Elias noticed her touching the old chains in her pocket when people stared too long, as if part of her still expected hatred. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Thura finally broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Elias nodded. Her voice became quieter, more vulnerable than he had ever heard before. "That night in the desert," she said slowly, "why did you call me beautiful after seeing my face?" The question clearly haunted her, not because she doubted him, because she could not understand him. Elias looked toward the memorial statue towering above the plaza, then back at her, and smiled softly. Because kindness survives longer than beauty ever could. Thura's eyes lowered slightly. For years, people saw only her scars, but Elias had seen the person beneath them. The woman who carried strangers through fire. The soldier who protected people who hated her. The lonely soul who still chose compassion after the galaxy gave her every reason to become cruel. And suddenly, for the first time in 20 years, Thura walked through the streets of Blackstone Colony with her face completely uncovered. People turned to look as she passed. But this time, nobody looked away.